Alright, welcome back. So, when I left off, I just finished reading chapter 25. And a lot of stuff happened there, so I can't do much of a recap. But they met Geode, and Aragon did some magic. He was able to listen into their conversation. And so Brahm's being a little bit sketchy and not telling Aragon some stuff. And now we are on chapter 26, which is The Witch and the Werecat. It was late in the morning when Aragon woke. He dressed, washed his face in the basin, then held the mirror up to his brushed hair and brushed it into place. Something about his reflection made him stop and look closer. His face has changed since they had run out of Carvajal just a short while ago. Any baby fat was gone now, stripped away by traveling, sparring, and training. His cheekbones were more prominent, and the line in his jaw was sharper. There was a slight cast to his eyes that, when he looked closely, gave his face a wild, alien appearance. He held the mirror at arm's length, and his face resumed its normal semblance. But it still did not seem quite his own. Okay, 1 second. The music is on and I forgot to turn it off. There we go. All right. A little disturbed, he slung his bow and quiver across his back, then left the room. Before he had reached the end of the hall, the butler caught up with him and said, "Sir, Neil left with my master for the castle earlier. He said that you could do whatever you want today, because he will not return until this evening." Aragon thanked him for the message, then eagerly began exploring Term. For hours he wandered the streets, entering every shop that struck his fancy, and chatting with various people. Eventually he was forced back to Geode's by his empty stomach and lack of money. When he reached the street where the merchant lived, he stopped at the herbalist's shop next door. It was an unusual place for a store. The other shops were down by the city wall, not cramped between expensive houses. He tried to look in the windows, but they were covered with a thick layer of crawling plants. Curious, he went inside. At first he saw nothing, because the store was so dark, but then his eyes adjusted to the faint greenish light that filtered through the windows. A colorful bird with wild tail feathers and sharp, powerful beak looked at Aragon inquisitively from a cage near the window. The walls were covered with plants. Vines clung to the ceiling, obscuring all but an old chandelier, and on the floor was a large pot with a yellow flower. A collection of mortars, pestles, metal bowls, and a clear crystal ball the size of Aragon's head rested on a long counter. He walked to the counter, carefully stepping around complex machines, crates of rocks, piles of scrolls, and other objects he did not recognize. The wall behind the counter was covered with drawers of every size. Some of them were no longer than his smallest finger, while others were big enough for a barrel. There was a foot-wide gap in the shelves far above. A pair of red eyes suddenly flashed from a dark space, and a large, fierce cat leapt onto the counter. It had a lean body with powerful shoulders and oversized paws. A shaggy mane surrounded its angular face. Its ears were tipped with black tufts. White fangs curved down over its jaw. Altogether, it did not look like any cat Aragon had ever seen. It inspected him with shrewd eyes, then flicked its tail dismissively. On a whim, Aragon reached out with his mind and touched the cat's consciousness. Gently he prodded it with his thoughts, trying to make it understand that he was a friend. "You don't have to do that." Aragon looked around in alarm. The cat ignored him and licked a paw. "Saphira, where are you?" he asked. No one answered. Puzzled, he leaned against the counter and reached for what looked like a wood rod. "That wouldn't be wise." "Stop playing games, Saphira," he snapped, then picked up the rod. A shock of electricity exploded throughout his body, and he fell to the floor writhing. The pain slowly faded, leaving him gasping for air. The cat jumped down and looked at him. "You aren't very smart for a dragon rider. I did warn you." "You said that?" exclaimed Aragon. The cat yawned and stretched and sauntered across the floor, weaving in between objects. "Who else?" "But you're just a cat," he objected. The cat yowled and stalked back to him. It jumped on his chest and crouched there, looking at him with gleaming eyes. Aragon tried to sit up, but it growled, showing its fangs. "Do I look like other cats?" "No." "Then what makes you think I am one?" Aragon started to say something, but the creature dug its claws into his chest. "Obviously, your education has been neglected. I, to correct your mistake, am a werecat. There aren't many of us left. But I think even a farm boy should have heard of us." "I didn't know you were real," said Aragon, fascinated. A werecat? He was indeed fortunate. They were always flitting around on the edge of the stories, keeping to themselves and occasionally giving advice. If the legends were true, they had magical powers, lived longer than humans, and usually know more than they were told. The werecat blinked lazily. "Knowing is independent of being. I did not know you existed before you bumbled in here and ruined my nap. Yet that doesn't mean you weren't real before you woke me." Aragon was lost by its reasoning. "I'm sorry I disturbed you." "I was getting up anyway," it said. It leapt back under the counter and licked its paw. "If I were you, I wouldn't hold on to that rod much longer. It's going to shock you again in a few seconds." He hastily put the rod back where he had found it. "What is it?" "A common and boring artifact, unlike myself." "But what's it for?" "Didn't you find out?" The werecat finished cleaning its paw, stretched once more, and jumped back to its sleeping place. It sat down, tucked its paws under its breast, and closed its eyes, purring. "Wait," said Aragon. "What's your name?" One of the werecat's slanted eyes cracked open. "I go by many names. If you are looking for a proper one, you will have to seek elsewhere." The eye closed. Aragon gave up and turned to leave. "However, you may call me Solumbum." "Thank you," said Aragon seriously. Solumbum's purring grew louder. The door to the shop swung open, letting in a beam of sunlight. Angela entered with a cloth bag full of plants. Her eyes flickered at Solumbum, and she looked startled. "He says you talked with him." "You can talk with him too?" asked Aragon. She tossed her head. "Of course, but that doesn't mean he'll say anything back." She set her plants on the counter, then walked behind it and faced him. "He likes you. That's unusual. Most of the time, Solumbum doesn't show himself to customers. In fact, he says that you show some promise, given a few years of work." "Thanks." "It's a compliment coming from him. You're only the third person to come here who has been able to speak with him. The first was a woman, many years ago. The second was a blind beggar. And now you. But I don't run a store just so I can prattle on. Is there anything you want? Or did you only come in to look?" "Just to look," said Aragon, still thinking about the werecat. "Besides, I don't really need any herbs." "That's not all I do," said Angela with a grin. "The rich fool lords pay me for love potions and the like. I never claim that they work, but for some reason they keep coming back. But I don't think you need those chicaneries. Would you like your fortune told? I do that too. For all the rich fool ladies." Aragon laughed. "No, I'm afraid my fortune is pretty much unreadable, and I don't have any money." Angela looked at Solumbum curiously. "I think," she gestured at the crystal ball resting on the counter, "that's only for show anyway. It doesn't do anything. But I have to wait here. I'll be right back." She hurried into a room at the back of the shop. She came back, breathless, holding a leather pouch, which she set on the counter. "I haven't used these for so long, I almost forgot where they were. Now, sit across from me and I'll show you why I went to all this trouble." Aragon found a stool and sat. Solemnbum's eyes glowed from the gap in the drawers. Angela laid a thick cloth on the counter, then poured a handful of smooth bones, each slightly longer than his finger. Onto it, runes and symbols were inscribed along their sides. "These," she said, touching them gently, "are the knuckle bones of a dragon. Don't ask me where I got them. It's a secret I won't reveal. But unlike tea leaves, crystal balls, or even divining cards, these have true power. They do not lie. Though understanding what I say is complicated. If you wish, I will cast and read them for you, but understand that to know one's fate can be a terrible thing. You must be sure of your decision." Aragon looked at the bones with a feeling of dread. There lies once what was one of Saphira's kin. To know one's face, to know one's fate. How can I make this decision when I don't know what lies in wait for me, and whether I will like it? Ignorance is indeed bliss. "Why do you offer this?" he asked. "Because of Solemnbum. You may have been rude, but the fact that he spoke to you makes you special. He is a werecat, after all. I offered to do this for the other 2 people who talked with him. Only the woman agreed to it. Selena was her name. Ah, she regretted it too. Her fortune was bleak and painful. I don't think she believed it. Not at first." Emotion overcame Aragon, bringing tears to his eyes. "Selena," he whispered to himself. "His mother's name. Could it have been her? Was her destiny so horrible that she had to abandon me?" "Do you remember anything about her fortune?" he asked, feeling sick. Angela shook her head and sighed. "It was long ago, so the details have melted into the rest of my memory, which isn't as good as it used to be. Besides, I'm not to tell you what I do remember." That was for her and her alone. It was sad, although I've never forgotten the look on her face. Aragon closed his eyes and struggled to regain control of his emotions. "Why do you complain about your memory?" he asked, to distract himself. "You're not that old." Dimples appeared on Angela's cheeks. "I'm flattered, but don't be deceived. I'm much older than I look. The appearance of youth probably comes from having to eat my own herbs, when times are lean." Smiling, Aragon took a deep breath. "If that was my mother, and she could have bared to have her fortune told, I can too. Cast the bones for me," he said solemnly. Angela's face became grave as she grasped the bones in each hand. Her eyes closed, her lips moved in a soundless murmur. Then she said powerfully, "Meinen, Werda, Hungen," and tossed the bones into the cloth. They fell and jumbled together, gleaming in the faint light. The words rang in Aragon's ears. He recognized them from the ancient language and realized with apprehension that to use them for magic, Angela must be a witch. She had not lied. This was a true fortune-telling. Minutes slowly passed as she studied the bones. Finally, Angela leaned back and heaved a long sigh. She wiped her brow and pulled out a wineskin from under the counter. "Do you want some?" she asked. Aragon shook his head. She shrugged and drank deeply. "This," she said, wiping her mouth, "is the hardest reading I've ever done. You were right. Your future is nigh impossible to see. I've never known of anyone's fate being so tangled and clouded. I was, however, able to wrestle a few answers from it." Solemnbum jumped onto the counter and settled there, watching them both. Aragon clenched his hands as Angela pointed to one of the bones. "I will start here," she said slowly, "because it is the clearest to understand." The symbol on the bone was a long horizontal line with a circle resting on it. "Infinity, or long life," said Angela quietly. "This is the first time I have ever seen it come up in someone's future. Most of the time, it's the aspen or elm. Both signs that a person will live for a normal span of years. Whether this means that you will live long, or live forever, or that you will only have an extraordinary long life, I'm not sure. Whatever it foretells, you must be sure that many years lie ahead of you." No surprises there. I am a rider, thought Aragon. Was Angela only going to tell him things he already knew? Now the bones grow harder to read, as the rest are in a confused pile. Angela touched 3 of them. Here a wandering path, lightning bolt, and sailing ship all lie together, a pattern I've never seen, only heard of. The wandering path shows that you have many choices in your future, some of which you face even now. I see great battles raging around you, some of them fought for your sake. I see mighty powers of this land struggling to control your will and destiny. Countless possible futures await you, all of them filled with blood and conflict. But only one will bring you happiness and peace. Beware of losing your way, for you are one of the few who are truly free to choose their own fate. That freedom is a gift, but it is also a responsibility, for more binding than chains. Her face grew sad, and yet, as if to counteract that, here is the lightning bolt. It is a terrible omen. There is doom upon you, but of what sort I know not. Part of it lies in the death, one that rapidly approaches and will cause you much grief, but the rest awaits in a great journey. Look closely at this bone. You can see how its end rests on that of a sailing ship. That is impossible to misunderstand. Your fate will be to leave this land forever. Where you end up, I know not, but you will never again stand in a glacier. This is inescapable. It will come to pass even if you try to avoid it. Her words frightened Aragon. Another death. Who must I lose now? His thoughts immediately went to Roran. Then he thought about his homeland. What could ever force me to leave? And where would I go? If there are lands across the sea or to the east, only the elves know of them. Angela rubbed her temples and breathed deeply. The next bone is easier to read, and perhaps a bit more pleasant. Aragon examined it, and saw a rose blossom inscribed by 3 horns of crescent moon. Angela smiled and said, An epic romance is in your future, extraordinary, as the moon indicates, for that is a magical symbol, and strong enough to outlast empires. I cannot say if this passion will end happily, but your love is of noble birth and heritage. She is powerful, wise, and beautiful beyond compare. Of noble birth, thought Aragon in surprise. How could that ever happen? I have no more standing than the poorest of farmers. Now for the last 2 bones, the tree and the hawthorn root, which cross each other strongly. I wish that this were not so. It can only mean more trouble, but betrayal is clear, and it will come from within your family. Roran wouldn't do that, objected Aragon abruptly. I wouldn't know, said Angela carefully. But the bones have never lied, and that is what they say. Doubt wormed into Aragon's mind, but he tried to ignore it. What reason would there have to be for Roran to turn on him? Angela put a comforting hand on his shoulder and offered him a wineskin again. This time Aragon accepted the drink, and it made him feel better. After all, death might be welcome, he joked nervously. Betrayal from Roran. It couldn't happen. It won't. It might be, said Angela solemnly, then laughed slightly. But you shouldn't fret about what has yet to occur. The only way the future can harm us is by causing worry. I guarantee that you'll feel better once you're out in the sun. Perhaps. Unfortunately, he reflected wryly, nothing she said will make sense until it's already happened. If it really does. He amended himself. You used words of power, he noted quietly. Angela's eyes flashed. What I wouldn't give to see how the rest of your life plays out. You can speak to werecats, know of the ancient language, and have a most interesting future. Also, few young men with empty pockets and rough traveling clothes can expect to be loved by a noble woman. Who are you? Aragon realized that the werecat must not have told Angela that he was a rider. He almost said Evan, but changed his mind and simply stated, I am Aragon. Angela arched her eyebrows. Is that who you are, or your name? She asked. Both, said Aragon with a small smile, thinking of his namesake, the first rider. Now I'm all the more interested in seeing how your life will unfold. Who was the ragged man with you yesterday? Aragon decided that one more name couldn't hurt. His name is Brahm. A guffaw suddenly burst out of Angela. Doubling her over in mirth, she wiped her eyes and took a sip of wine, then fought off another attack of merriment. Finally, grasping for breath, she forced out, "Oh, that one! I had no idea." "What is it?" demanded Aragon. No, don't be upset," said Angela, hiding a smile. "It's only that, well, he is known by those in my profession. I'm afraid that the poor man's doom, or future, if you will, is something of a joke with us." "Don't insult him. He's a better man than any you could find," snapped Aragon. Peace, chided Angela with amusement. "I know that. But if we meet again, the right time, I'll be sure to tell you about it. But in the meantime, you should—" She stopped speaking as Solomon padded between them. The werecat stared at Aragon with unblinking eyes. "Yes?" asked Aragon, irritated. "Listen closely, and I will tell you 2 things. When the time comes and you need a weapon, look under the roots of the Manoa tree. Then, when all seems lost and your power is insufficient, go to the rock of Kuthian and speak your name to open the vault of souls." Before Aragon could ask what Solomon meant, the werecat walked away, waving its tail ever so gracefully. Angela tilted her head, coils of dense hair shadowing her forehead. "I don't know what he said, and I don't want to know. He spoke to you and only you. Don't tell anyone else." "I think I have to go," said Aragon, shaken. "If you want to," said Angela, smiling again. "You are welcome to stay here as long as you like, especially if you buy some of my goods. But go if you wish. I'm sure that we've given you enough to ponder for a while." "Yes." Aragon quickly made his way to the door. "Thank you for reading my future, I think." "You're welcome," said Angela, still smiling. Aragon exited the shop and stood in the street, squinting until he adjusted his eyes to the brightness. It was a few minutes before he could think calmly about what he had learned. He started walking, his steps unconsciously quickening until he dashed out of term, feet flying as he headed to Saphira's hiding place. He called to her from the base of the cliff. A minute later, she soared down and bore him up to the cliff top. When they were both safely on the ground, Aragon told her about his day. And so he concluded, "I think Brahm's right. I always seem to be where there's trouble." "You should remember what the werecat told you. It's important." "How do you know?" he asked curiously. "I'm not sure, but the names he used feel powerful." "Kuthian," she said, rolling the word around. "No, we should forget what he said." "Do you think I should tell Brahm?" "It's your choice, but think of this. He has no right to know your future. To tell him of Solomon and his words will only raise questions you may not want to answer, and if you decide to only ask him what those words mean, he will want to know where you learned them. Do you think you can lie convincingly to him?" "No," admitted Aragon. "Maybe I won't say anything. Still, this might be too important to hide." They talked until there was nothing more to say. Then they sat together, companionably, watching the trees until dusk. Aragon hurried back to Term and was soon knocking on Geod's door. "Is Neil back?" he asked the butler. "Is Neil back?" he asked the butler. "Yes, sir. I believe he's in the study right now." "Thank you," said Aragon. He strode into the room and peeked inside. Brahm was sitting before a fire smoking. "How did it go?" asked Aragon. "Bloody awful," growled Brahm around his pipe. "So you talked to Brand?" "Not that it did any good." "This administrator of the trade is the worst sort—" "Not that it did any good. This administrator of the trade is the worst sort of bureaucrat.
He abides by every rule, delights in making his own, whenever he can inconvenience someone, and at the same time believes that he's doing good."
"Then he won't let us see the records?" asked Aragon.
"No,"
snapped Brom, exasperated.
"nothing I could say would sway him. He refused even bribes, substantial ones, too. I didn't think I would ever meet a noble who wasn't corrupt. Now that I have, I find I prefer them when they're greedy bastards."
He puffed furiously on his pipe and mumbled a steady stream of curses. When he seemed to have calmed, Aragon asked tentatively, "So what now?"
"I'm going to take the next week and teach you how to read."
And after that, a smile split upon Brom's face.
"After that, we're going to give Bran a nasty surprise."
Aragon pestered him for details, but Brom refused to say any more. Dinner was held in a sumptuous dining room. Geode sat at one end of the table, a hard-eyed Helen at the other. Brom and Aragon were seated between them, which Aragon felt was a dangerous place to be. Empty chairs on either side of them, but he didn't mind the space. It helped to protect him from the glares of their hosts. The food was served quietly, and Geode and Helen wordlessly began eating. Aragon followed suit, thinking, "I've had cheerier meals at funerals." And he had in Carvajal. He remembered so many burials that had been sad, yes, but not unduly so. This was different. He could feel the simmering resentment pouring from Helen throughout the dinner. And that is the end of chapter 26. And I will read the rest at a later date.